I'm going to tell you something that you may not know about Marlene Merrill, a member here at Blue Ridge. And Marlene, she's given me the green light to say this morning. She and I traveled this past Monday down to Southwest City for Helen Sullen's funeral. I was really grateful for Marlene's presence because it represented your care and concern to the family as we gathered for that graveside ceremony. I don't know if you would remember, but Monday the wind was blowing so hard, and the family had gathered around the gravesite with one of those canopies that were there and overhead. And the funeral directors and a number of the family members had to just hang on to the tarp as the tarp was snapping in the wind. And it was as though Helen's spirit was just blowing through the place. It was beautiful. Marlene helped out with the driving, which was a great thing because it's a 3-hour ride down to Southwest City. As the name suggests, it's located literally in the southwest corner of the state, and they have a marker there where if you kind of contort yourself a little bit, you can have part of your feet in Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma at the same time. Now, I drove the opening leg down there, which was pretty much just a straight shot down I-71, and later we switched off, and Maureen drove the final stretch. Now, the piece of road between I-71 and Southwest City resembles, I think, one of those German road test tracks where you have all those switchbacks and hills and tight turns. So what I didn't realize about Maureen is that in her spare time, evidently, Marlene, I'm sorry, and she's in the nursery, Marlene. What I didn't totally realize about Marlene is that in her spare time, she's a NASCAR driver. We were flying through those hills. And it was at that point that I thought to myself, these road signs are really good. You know, the ones that show you what's coming up ahead, and those road signs that show you that within a 100-yard span, you're going from 50 to 20. Those were all helpful. I had a second driving experience this week that struck me as Janet and I were in Cape Cod for the funeral yesterday. And we were driving between towns, and I pulled up to an intersection, and I maneuvered into the left-hand turning lane. This is a very small town. And the light was red, so I came to a stop. And a car approached on the other side of the intersection and came to a stop and didn't have any turn signal on, so I assumed that they were coming straight through the intersection. So the light turned green, and I waited. But the other car gave me one of those quick flashes of the headlights, and I was like, oh. And so I pulled through, and then that car, after I had cleared the intersection, came straight on through and went on their way. I wasn't accustomed or familiar with that particular driving courtesy, and Janet, who's spent a little more time on Cape Cod in years past, said that that's a common thing that folks do in those small towns. It was an example of just one rule of life. And it actually, in a way, told me a little something about that other driver and maybe a little something about the people in that town that we were driving through. What rules do you follow in your life? What rules guide you when you're behind the wheel? What rules guide you when you're at work, at church, at Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, or off to camp? What guides you when you're around family or friends? What guides you when you are in the midst of a disagreement? When you face a big decision in your life, what is it that guides you? What rules do you follow in your life? The people of Israel had been wandering through the wilderness, and they came to Mount Sinai. And it's there that they received these 10 commandments. As we heard the choir and we watched the children, I wonder if these 10 commandments formed into any particular groups for you. If you noticed that there are a couple categories, if you will, of the 10 commandments. The first 4 are what we might call the vertical commandments. They're the commandments that speak to our relationship with God. Have no other gods before me. Kind of notice that it doesn't say that there are no other gods besides me. Back in that ancient day, it was commonly thought that there was a whole realm of gods. But for the Israelites, they said, have no other God before me. That was groundbreaking at that time. But it was establishing that there is only Yahweh. There is no one else before me. And it seems kind of relevant today still, given that in our society, there are a bunch of gods with a little g that are out there in our world vying for our attention and our devotion. Don't make, don't bow down, don't worship any idols. Nothing comes before God. The third commandment, don't take the Lord's name in vain. That's just not a comment about don't curse. It's about don't take God's name and use it for a purpose which is not of God. And I imagine that you could think of a whole range of examples where you've encountered people taking the Lord's name in vain, and they're not cursing, but they're seeking to use God in a way to further themselves, some other cause that really has nothing to do with what God is about. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. 4 commandments linking and speaking about our relationship with the Almighty. The next 6 commandments, if you will, are the horizontal commandments that are about how we relate to one another. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder or commit adultery or steal or bear false witness or covet. Now in Matthew and Mark, Jesus is kind of quizzed about the commandments. Which are the greatest commandments, Jesus is asked. And in Mark, he replies, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. And the second is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Love God, love one another. You hear those 2 categories from the 10? And Jesus prioritizes them, summarizes them in those 2. I don't know how you relate to the 10 commandments. I don't know where they fit in our lives today. Do they feel relevant to you? Do they feel life-giving? Do they feel central to how you live your life? Do you have them present anywhere in your home? Do you ever think in terms of these 10 commandments? Or do you find them to be a list of heavy to-dos from long ago that maybe feel a little out of date? For sure, these 10 commandments are imperatives of God, 2 of which Jesus lifts up in summary, imperatives for how we live our lives. But I want to invite us today to think about the 10 commandments in a slightly different way. Apart from thinking of them as commandments, which they are, I want to invite you to think of the 10 commandments as a form of revelation of God. It's telling us about who God is, what God values, what God hopes for, what God desires, and what offends God, and what pains God, and what wounds God. It's a Hebrew Bible scholar, Walter Brueggemann, who says this of the 10 Commandments: these commands might be taken not as a series of rules, but as a proclamation from God's own mouth of who God is and how God shall be practiced by the community of liberated slaves. Who God is. And when I think about these 10 commandments, it suggests to me 3 things about God. And I'm sure you could think of others, but 3 stand out for me. First, that first group in which there are no other gods before me. There should be no idols. In demanding this total loyalty, we see that God is faithful to us at all times, no matter what we may have done, no matter what may have happened in our life. God is always faithful to us and always calling us back into communion with God. Second, by demanding that we be faithful to God and claiming that we're to set a day apart, a day to be holy, and by including a series of commandments which focus on how we relate to one another, all these show that relationship matters to God, and that God hungers to be in relationship with us. The timing of the delivery of these commandments tells us a third thing about God. Because you'll notice the people have been wandering in the wilderness when God brings the commandments to them. God didn't come to the people while they were still in Egypt, while they were still slaves, and said, okay, look, these are the commandments that I have for you, and if you agree to these rules, then I will, A, free you from under Pharaoh's heel, B, I'll get you through that Red Sea, and C, I'll see you through the wilderness, and I'll feed you when there's nothing else. God didn't make that demand. God didn't establish a prenup with the people of Israel. He acted first, unconditionally. And so the God of the 10 Commandments has expectations, to be sure, has hopes, desires, and is calling us into a life of living in particular ways with God's self and with one another. But this is also a God of great grace. Sometimes we tend to think of, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, God of judgment and law over here, God of grace, only in the New Testament. But this is a picture of tremendous grace of how these commandments come to us. After Jesus cleared the temple, the money changers, the Jewish leaders asked for a sign. They wanted to know, under what authority is it that you would do this? And so, what credentials do you have? They want to ask. And so Jesus gives them a sign. In fact, he tells them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. It is a revelation of God about what is to come. But the scribes don't get it, of course. In this season of Lent, we're taking a journey to the cross. Is there any greater expression of God's faithfulness to you? Is there any greater expression of God's desire to be in relationship with you? And is there any greater expression of God's grace than this Son who goes to walk to the cross and to give his life for you and for me? You may be driving along on a road that is full of twists and turns. Or you may be sitting at an intersection trying to figure out whether you go left or you go right or you go straight. And posted along the way are these 10 commandments and the cross. They are signs of faithfulness. They are signs of love in relationship. And they are signs of grace. They are signs of life for us all. Amen.